Good afternoon, everyone. Lots of new faces. I think I'm going to start by introducing myself. I'm Bradford. I've been teaching here this is my 4th year. I mainly teach international trade law and also EU law and comparative and international antitrust law. And today what I want to talk about is, I'll talk about European Union. And I hope it will be a refreshing talk in the context of this current debate, which really portrays EU as an incredibly weak, if not almost useless actor. So it actually shows that the EU is not necessarily a weak entity without any ability to exert global influence. So the way when I talk about influence and when I talk about power, I invite you to think it much more broadly. And I invite you to think about law as a very important source of power. So EU obviously doesn't have the kind of military. There's no common EU army that would make EU a very powerful traditional actor in the sense that we often think about international relations. When we think about global economic power, all eyes are now focused on when exactly China will overtake the US in terms of having the largest GDP in the world. Nobody talks about the EU. But what I'm instead arguing in a paper that I'm currently working on right now, which is called the Brussels effect, is that EU has actually enormous power, but it's not power through traditional means. It's power through law and power through regulation. And the EU is in a unique position globally to unilaterally exercise that kind of power, to basically engage in what I call unilateral regulatory globalization. That the EU rules migrate to the rest of the world. It's a very passive form of influence. EU doesn't really actually need to coerce any country into adopting its laws. EU is not imposing those laws. At the same time, those laws are felt here in the United States, they are felt in China and in other markets, even though we are not willingly welcoming those laws. So this is a phenomenon that falls somewhere between coercion and cooperation. It's not regulatory globalization that we see as a result of international treaties, that the US and the EU agree that let's apply the EU rule. But it's not the EU that is in a position to force the US to actively enact its laws. It's really rather a process that is done through the markets. It's markets that facilitate the transmission of the EU laws. So this conventional wisdom that thinks about EU as a very weak actor often also uses this weakness to explain why the EU in particular is a big proponent of international institutions and multilateral cooperation. And it's often contrasted to the US as us being very unilateralist, us being very skeptical of the ability of the WTO and other institutions to advance our goals. So in this sense, this paper overturns it and shows that EU is not just a committed multilateralist, it's also a very aggressive unilateralist. So let me say a little bit to help you put this into the kind of context of regulatory cooperation and the kind of theoretical debates that we talk about. So you may have heard about Delaware effect, or you may have heard about California effect. So the idea is that we have this conversation, what international law, what international trade does to domestic regulation. And often what we are worried about is that we see something that is called a race to the bottom. That countries or individual states within the United States that are willing to improve their relative competitive position vis-a-vis other states are willing to enact lower regulatory standards in order to attract more capital, more businesses, and thereby then become more competitive. So this is the kind of race to the bottom hypothesis. And some have though said that trade doesn't necessarily lead to low standards. We may actually see trade lead to much higher global standards. And this is what we capture by California effect in the US. We have a big state, California, that often prefers stricter environmental and consumer protection standards than the rest of the United States. But California, because of the size of its market, it's actually often in a position to ratchet the regulatory standards up in the other states as well. That's because it may be far too expensive for a company to produce different products for California and then for the rest of the United States. So scale economies alone dictate that California, the highest standard, becomes the standard to which producers are producing. And in a way, when I talk about Brussels effect, I talk about California effect in a global context. What California is doing to the US, Brussels, the EU, is doing to the rest of the world. So let me give you a few examples from areas of law where we see this. And bear with me, I don't say this happens everywhere. I think one of the key contributions that I'm trying to do in this paper is to try to offer a theory of when this happens, which kind of laws are subject to Brussels effect, and which cannot be externalized the same way. So one famous example is antitrust. So those of you who've taken antitrust, or even if you were, that's already a decade ago, but assuming you were reading news, business news at that time, you've heard about the GE-Honeywell merger. So two American companies that wanted to merge, over $40 billion transaction, US clears it, and the EU says no. So what happens? The entire transaction is killed. So it's the most stringent jurisdiction that is in the position to determine the fate of a global transaction. And GE Honeywell is probably the most dramatic example, but it doesn't stand alone. So often in international merger decisions, when there are simultaneous investigations in the EU and the US, EU is the one that wants more aggressive remedies, more aggressive commitments. So if EU says, yes, this merger can proceed, but only if you divest your plant in Japan, US couldn't care less about you divesting your plant in Japan. You divest your plant in Japan if you want the merger to close. So antitrust is one example. We also see this in privacy. So EU takes privacy regulation much more seriously than the US does. And this has changed the business practices of companies like Google. So often, Google would probably like to have a different set of rules for the US, but it's technically very hard to separate the searches done by Europeans and those done by Americans. Thus, the higher EU standard starts to govern the entire global privacy regime. We also see this in environmental regulation. There's a very new recent law that came into effect the 1st of January this year, whereby the EU is now requiring that all the airlines that either land in the EU or take off from an EU airport need to buy emission permits. But they don't only need to buy emission permits for the period of time they are flying in the European airspace. They need to buy it for the entire journey. So when you fly from San Francisco to London, you need to pay for the emissions that you have incurred during the entire journey, even though only 9% of the emissions actually occur in the European airspace. So the US airlines are already litigating this, thus far unsuccessfully, in the European courts. So that's one example. We see this a lot in health, in food safety, in consumer protection, and many different areas of law. So let's now try to think about a little bit why we see it in these particular areas. Is there some kind of an underlying theory that would help us explain why this unilateral regulation can take place and why EU is the source of those laws and not the United States? So the theoretical basis for Brussels effect starts from a rather obvious intuition. Obviously, you need to have a really large domestic market to be able to do that. Only big countries can do that. No matter how stringent Uruguay wants to go in its environmental regulation, it's not going to provide a global standard. So firms are gravitating towards the standards that prevail in the most important markets. But that criteria alone, the large market, doesn't explain why EU should be the source of global standards. US has a large market. EU is probably larger in terms of 500 million consumers. There's even a greater, rather affluent consumer base. But China is a big market. Japan is a big market. EU alone shouldn't be then exercising Brussels effect. So what else do you need to have besides a large market share? You need to have regulatory capacity. So you need to actually have the ability to translate that market size in a concrete influence. You need to have the institutional legal infrastructure to actually regulate, to promulgate those rules and to enforce those rules, and actually enforce costs for non-compliance with those rules. So this basically leaves us with the US and the EU. US has just as capable regulatory institutions as the EU does. But why EU is the source of global standards? So one thing is that you need to have a preference for strict rules. You actually need to have domestic political economic conditions that prompt you towards the kind of rules that become more stringent. And this is where we've seen a change. Those rules used to come from the United States. Up until the 80s, we were the ones with the strictest environmental laws. And then EU just surpassed us. Our preferences today are not gearing us towards as high standards as the EU preferences are. So EU simply prefers to enact stricter rules. And because of this logic, you need to have the stricter rules for them to trump and make other regulators obsolete in the process. So in addition to having the political will to actually employ the regulatory capacity that can operationalize your large market size, you need to have a preference for certain type of regulatory targets. And that is, you basically want to regulate inelastic targets. And that's exactly what the EU is doing. EU is mainly regulating consumer markets. It's much harder for you to be a regulatory imperialist if you mainly focus on regulating capital. If you ratchet your capital regulations too high, capital can move. But it's hard for you as a manufacturer to move the 500 million consumers away from EU and serve them in some other market. That's why EU can actually hold on to its laws, because the regulatory targets cannot escape its jurisdiction by relocating. So these four conditions actually only show that EU has the capacity to regulate extraterritorially. That when an American firm wants to trade in Europe, it actually needs to abide by the European laws. But for this to really amount to regulatory globalization, we need to have that same firm have the incentive to apply the same rules when it's operating in the US market, when it's exporting to China, when it's exporting to Brazil. And that brings me to a last but very critical condition of the theory, is that you basically need to have non-divisible standards. And there are different types of non-divisibility, but all of them are basically characterized by the idea that the companies have the incentive to apply a single standard throughout their production or conduct, instead of trying to take advantage of lower standards in jurisdictions that would allow them to do so. So one example that I mentioned earlier already shows one type of non-divisibility. That was the merger example. So antitrust is not divisible in the sense that you can have a merger proceed with respect to one jurisdiction, but not with respect to another. That's what I call legal non-divisibility. My example about Google's inability to separate the searches done in Europe and in the US, or making it technically rather impossible, that's my example of technical non-divisibility. Often this non-divisibility, though, is driven by scale economies. So it's a kind of economic non-divisibility that, yes, in principle, you could produce different products for different markets. But if there's anything to scale economies, it's just not in your interest to do so. So you're better off having one product that you trade in globally. So that's basically the conditions under which we can see the Brussels effect take place. Let me now talk a little bit about why the EU does this. So what motivates EU to do this? And if you listen to the US critics of any of these regulatory ambitions that have an influence on commerce in the US on a daily basis, they call this regulatory imperialism. They basically say this is a very conscious way to try to impose your rules and your vision of the world to the rest of the world. What EU responds is that, wait a minute, all we're doing is we're regulating our own market. And if you choose to trade in the EU, you need to trade by our rules. It's your idea then if you want to trade by those rules in the US as well. That's not something we are imposing to you. That's what the markets are doing, but that's your choice. Another defense that the EU has, let's say about these flights, the emissions emission permits that you need to buy. EU is basically saying, we are a global benevolent hegemon. We are providing a global public good. So if you are failing to regulate, if the international process doesn't yield us the kind of treaties we need, you should be grateful. We do it for you. So that's another one that EU is saying. EU certainly doesn't think that it's exercising regulatory imperialism. What I say in the paper, though, that I think there are two things that are motivating the EU most. Without going in, I don't think this is regulatory imperialism. I'm not sure EU is always, or at least we can say that everybody would agree that EU is a benevolent global hegemon. Instead, I think there are two things. One is that I think this is more like an accidental byproduct of EU's internal goals. EU has been very focused on creating a single European market. A huge part of that enterprise has been to enact a set of laws that harmonize the laws across the member states. That has already ratcheted the standards up within the EU. And at the same time, it has become an accidental byproduct when the trading partners started to say that, look, now we have the same laws that apply to 500 million consumers, which means we probably need to change our practices globally. EU didn't, that wasn't the initial motivation. When EU notices, though, that it happens, EU is rather pleased. It can basically accomplish two of its goals at the same time. It can defend its social preferences, the kind of view of the world that the EU believes is right for it, maybe to the others, but at least for the EU, which consists of high protection of consumer interest and the environment, health, food safety, and all that. But at the same time, EU doesn't need to compromise the competitiveness of its domestic industry. That's just sort of clearly in the EU's interest for that reason. So let me now move on to saying what the others can do about it. So why do we just stand by? Why do we let EU do this? What can the US do? What can the international institutions do? And my answer is very little. And that's why we don't do much. There's very little, there are very few tools at our disposal that would allow us to actually counter what the EU is doing. So first of all, we generally think that if there is a country or an entity that is regulating at suboptimally high level, it would be punished by the markets. But again, let me take you back to this inelasticity. The markets don't punish the EU. This is not like capital fleeing to another jurisdiction. EU can keep its consumers, and it has the power to regulate what are the terms on which you trade with those consumers. So what can the US do? So US can do very little to coerce the EU to change its laws. The US could obviously enter into a regulatory race with the EU. US has all this, but then it would need to prefer strict rules. US could say, okay, we want US rules to apply worldwide. That would mean we would ratchet our standards even higher than the EU, and we would be moved even further away from the welfare point that we think is optimal for us. So we're not going to enter into a regulatory race. More likely what we do is we defend our standard, we criticize the EU, and we basically become obsolete in the process. We let them regulate, but we cannot do anything to change it. What is interesting, what the US might do, so we don't like those international institutions, at least as a general matter. We don't really like international treaties. But if we face the option of being basically imposed, even though I don't like to use the word EU is not actively imposing, but the market mechanism exporting the EU rules to us, we may actually prefer international cooperation. But we may actually say, let's just try to negotiate a treaty with the EU on this environment or something, so at least we have a role in the process instead of basically being passive recipients of the rules that the EU sets unilaterally for us and the rest of the world. Mind you, it's not also, when I talk about the US being opposed to this, that doesn't mean everybody in the US is opposed to this. There are some in the US who win from this, who are actually great beneficiaries from the EU's regulatory excesses, like some would say. So first of all, there are consumer advocates. There are environmentalists here who think that the US standards are suboptimally low. They take some comfort in there being higher standards coming from the EU. The second important group of beneficiaries within the US are non-export oriented firms. So imagine the exporting firms who trade in the EU, who need to ratchet up their standards to meet the EU standards, who because of scale economy start producing to those more costly standards in the US as well. Now the non-export oriented firms who don't need to worry about EU rules actually have lower production costs and gain a competitive advantage in the US vis-a-vis those firms. So there are also winners in the US that probably shows that there's not a consistent, coherent opposition from all sides to what the EU is doing. So what about if we still think that we don't like this? Is there anything that the international institutions can do? And this is something I teach international law. I think about international institutions and treaties a lot. So we don't like to think that they are powerless, But at the same time, when we think about these examples, for instance, antitrust, privacy, neither of them is within the purview of the WTO. That would be the most likely candidate organization to actually take on these issues. And even if the WTO has sometimes had a stake in this, US has challenged, for instance, EU's food safety rules, the GMOs, that EU is very skeptical of. EU doesn't accept any of the hormone-treated beef, so no US beef is going into the EU. And US has challenged those as clear instances of protectionism. US has won both cases. EU has not complied with either. And what the US has done, actually very little. It still has suspended its retaliation in the GMO case. There's been EU constantly further litigates these matters and say, we are gathering more scientific evidence. This is not protectionism. Let's litigate this again. And still today, even though it's 10 years, there's no US beef going into the EU. So WTO sometimes can provide a venue for the US to challenge this. But the way the WTO remedies are structured, EU always has the choice of not complying. EU can rather choose to endure retaliation. So EU has been enduring US retaliation because it has insisted that the hormone-treated beef is not going to go into the EU. So you can't have specific performance and thereby change the kind of relief that, say, US beef producers would like to have. So, okay, if I think about the limited ability of any external forces to constrain the EU, what I'm arguing then instead is that it doesn't mean that EU can set the rules for the rest of the world in no matter the area that it chooses. So first of all, these conditions set clear boundaries to the type of laws that can be externalized. So sometimes EU is a large market, but it's not a large export market in every single good. If there are enough opportunities to export elsewhere, EU doesn't have this power. Then you just divert your trade to alternative markets. The other condition, the regulatory capacity. Yes, EU has these institutions, but there are many areas where the member states have not transferred the power to the EU. Energy is one, tax is another one. There we don't have this combined leverage of all the member states that the EU can actually use. Then the idea of strict rules. Yes, we generally in the EU like stricter rules, but we in the US also like some areas of law where we think that the rules should be stricter. So smoking and online gambling are two examples that the EU is not too worried about, and we are very worried about. At the same time, these general conditions dictate that we are not setting the global rules in tobacco or in online gambling, but at least EU is not in a position to export its rules because it doesn't prefer strict rules in those domains. Inelasticity. Now in connection with the financial crisis and the Eurozone problems, there's been a lot of discussion that the EU wants to impose a tax on financial transactions. Well, that, assuming we can get it through in the EU, is not going to be globalized because it's inelastic. So trading activity can just move to some extent outside of the EU. Non-divisibility. There are areas like labor standards. There are no scale economies of giving everybody European holidays if you have employees in Europe and America and Latin America. So employer can really neatly separate those and basically just adhere to the labor rules in the EU, but not in the rest of the world. But still, even with these caveats, this is a rather significant phenomenon. It's something that does impact all of us on a daily basis in the products that we consume, in the food that we eat, in the flights that we take, in the way the companies with whom we encounter daily structure their transactions. So it's something that we certainly will care about. But if we think about what's the limit of this, what are the boundaries of what the EU is doing? As much as I said that this has been driven by EU's internal motivation to build a single market, and not by any external motivation to be a global regulatory power. The same way, the way to constrain this, those constraints come from within the EU itself. So right now, when the EU's regulatory power appears to be at its height, we also see increasing divergence within the EU itself, a lot of pushback to the EU level regulation that has penetrated the national systems within the EU. There are greater divisions within the EU because of the enlargement. We have now 27 member states with very divergent preferences. So there's increasing conversation on how much sovereignty should we be ceding to Brussels, and should we rein in some of that back to the member states. And finally, the euro crisis doesn't help. So nothing in this account depends on the existence of the common currency. It depends on the existence of the single market. But the crisis surrounding the common currency mean that there is an increasing pushback on this idea of sovereignty within the EU, and sort of increasing demand to reinstate national sovereignty, which can then have an influence in terms of how much further powers are we willing to give to Brussels. So let me finish with one comment, and then I open it up for your questions. So this paper itself it's a descriptive paper. It's not a normative paper. I am not defending what the EU is doing, nor am I criticizing. That's not what interests me the most. We can have that conversation as well. But the paper itself, what I'm really interested is in uncovering this phenomena, explaining why and how international trade can actually lead to high as opposed to low standards, why those standards are set unilaterally, why they primarily emanate from the EU, and why the rest of the world can do very little about it. So let me open it up there, and I'm happy to take questions. Yes?
Wouldn't you say this is, I mean, to follow up with the description, that this is sort of an autoimmune kind of setting? Because it seems that autoimmune, something that will tend to destroy itself in the near future. I mean, I don't think that the euro crisis is necessarily something as a condiment to analyze this, but as the first outcome possibly of what you're discussing here, since I think what we're seeing now is the effects of European institutions trying to harmonize through common regulation things that might be not that easy to harmonize when you have different countries, not realizing that perhaps let those countries be different in terms of regulations and capacities, as federalism does here in the States, provides for a better environment for development. And to some extent, I think that companies will look at this set of regulations, and following course will say, okay, instead of setting up a company in Europe, I'm going to stay away from Europe to avoid antitrust regulation. And there you're going to have a discussion over, again, trade. So eventually you're going to get to the trade discussion because companies are going to move away from rigidity embedded in Europe.
Right, so I think there are two things. It's a great question. So one thing is that have we moved to the phase whereby the low-hanging fruit has been picked, the kind of easy areas of harmonization that everybody benefited from? We've done that. Now we're dealing with the rest that is increasingly contentious. We're trying to get it through across a much more divergent set of member states. So it has become much more controversial. So sort of the benefits of the common regulation are no longer all that clear. We're much more, the cost of it is much more, they are much more palpable. So that certainly is that we've gotten to the point in the sort of the whole process of integration, whereby we're either hitting the wall or we are sort of invited to further test and redefine what we understand by sovereignty. And that becomes much harder. I think you're absolutely right. The other thing that you say that whether there is something else, that this is a dynamic theory, obviously. Like the world wasn't like this earlier. I said the rules came from the US. The one question is, will there be the rules coming from China or another place sometime soon? That one, I think, like it may be that the emergence of other important markets will be able to diminish the EU's ability to do this. But there will be a while before China will catch up with the EU as a regulator. GDP per capita is a much greater predictor of the country's propensity to basically push through really strict environmental and consumer regulations than the GDP itself. The kind of demand for those is not even near there yet in China. But still, I think it may be changing. There are other sort of other markets that can become attractive. But your example of antitrust, for instance, it's hard because just by changing your location doesn't allow you to escape the jurisdiction of the EU. As long as anything that you do has an effect on the EU market, the EU can attach jurisdiction. And today there are very few companies that are able to carve out from a transaction a market of 500 million of rather affluent consumers. And that's why I think this is, I'm not saying that this is a theory that is going to, empire that is going to endure, but I think it's going to be rather gradual, and it's going to take a while before it can be fully contested from outside. So that's why I think the internal confrontation is going to be a much greater threat. Yes?
So to what extent does the criticism that there's a democratic deficit in the EU affecting sort of this reversion back to more national policies?
So I think it's a related question in the sense that, that there is a debate within the EU that this is actually something the bureaucrats have created. This is what the Commission is doing in the Brussels. This is not something that is reflecting the preferences of individuals in Holland and Greece and Sweden and France, but this is more of a bureaucratic set of regulations that have emerged. I mean, it's probably true, and I talk a little bit about in the paper how this is definitely in the bureaucratic interest of the Commission to expand its own leverage. But at the same time, these regulations have been adopted by the Council, represented by the Member States. Treaties have been ratified in domestic parliamentary systems according to their own rules. So I don't think that these are undemocratic rules. They have a backing of the EU. But I think what's really interesting here too, that this happens in two layers. So whatever is an EU rule, it's not necessarily something that 27 member states wanted. There's been a Brussels effect within the EU itself. Often these rules come from Germany. They come from Holland, from Nordic countries that advocate more stringent rules. And then they can get the kind of leverage and force behind those rules that they can be externalized within the EU, which then adopts those rules and externalizes them to the rest of the world. So actually the rules that we see in the EU are not even a reflection necessarily of the preferences of 500 million Europeans. They are often reflections of the preferences of the subset of individual member states within the EU that first managed to convert their preferences into EU rules. Yes?
Do you think that the chance that the EU will have to look for financial relief outside the EU, mainly China, will make China want to have a say in this and diminish the effect in the short term?
Sure, great. So it's a very fascinating dynamic that we are witnessing right now, that we have these institutions set by the Washington Consensus, IMF and the others, where the wealthy Europeans and Americans provided loans to developing countries. And now we have the EU itself that is actually in the position that is much weaker. It may be politically weakened. Whether China would, for instance, condition its loan to EU changing some of these rules, I doubt it. I mean, China was pushing back a lot on the airline emission case, saying that we are basically going to retaliate. We're not going to order Airbus planes, whatever we do to harm the EU. 2 weeks later, there was a massive order of Airbus going to China. So in terms of, there are just economic interests that are intertwined that is very hard for China necessarily to separate. China's growth is driven by access to export markets. It's in China's interest that EU is going to be okay. So if China gives a loan to the EU, it's not doing it out of solidarity. It's doing because Chinese companies need to be able to trade on that market. So there's much more going on, but I think it's a really interesting question as such that the political dynamic is certainly changing. What's interesting, though, that throughout this financial crisis, when the rest of us, what we do, we focus on what's happening in the euro. The various EU agencies just keep pushing out new rules. So the laws are coming out, and it's not just the EU is all focused on the euro crisis. The public discourse is focused on euro crisis. But this hasn't stopped the EU from regulating. This hasn't really changed the dynamic whereby other countries would have been able to somehow even softly coerce the EU to change the way it approaches its laws. Yes?
Have you looked at to what extent by ratcheting up the regulatory standards it creates more incentive for a black market within, and so that in a sense will undermine a lot of the regulatory progress there?
mean, I think that's more of a question if the EU just ratchets up regulation but can't really enforce it, that there are sort of more gaps in its enforcement. You know, in a way, I think it's plausible, but at the same time, this is a very efficient way. Think about Europeans being efficient, but it's a very efficient way for them to regulate because all the enforcement is done. The EU doesn't need to bear any cost of that. So even if EU would have diminished resources, it's fully capable of enforcing its laws because that's done mainly by domestic existing institutions. So it's domestic costs, domestic agencies that are implementing the EU's rules. And who is bearing the cost of this? It's individuals and companies, a lot of the foreign companies that are trading in the EU. So in terms of it's not more costly or difficult for the EU necessarily to enforce, whether the incentives to try to sort of circumvent these laws, they may be greater. But at the same time, EU is very capable of monitoring in terms of the consumer and environmental goods. There may be, there was a lot of, like I said, public threats by the US and China, for instance, when this airline emission thing got into effect. But we haven't really seen a concrete action. Whether there is the kind of gray market that we see companies finding ways to circumvent this, that is harder for me to know. But it's really hard because, you know, if you think about it normally in commerce, there's a longer supply chain. So all you need is one risk-averse actor there. So with the food safety, for instance, a lot of the cultivated grains and what have you that have GMOs are sold to multinational food processors. And they have a lot of say as to who they buy from. So they have the internal monitoring because they don't want to have marketing problems in the EU. So in the supply chain itself, there are internal checks because nobody wants to be in the position that whatever you produce is suddenly shut out of the EU market. Anything else? Do I see any more hands? Is this something you're worried about? Is this something that you are, is it sort of news to you? Should we worry about it? I should ask, like, to get a few of the Republican primary candidates to listen to or read the Brussels effect, because there seems to be a lot of talk now about the weaknesses of the EU and sort of the way we actually perceive weakness. Yes?
Can you please further explain about the elasticity in the EU market, and why is this unique in EU, and why is this not in the US or Japan or other developed markets?
Right, great. So the inelasticity, the whole idea is that if you choose to regulate the kind of targets that can move a jurisdiction, then your power to regulate them is limited. You hit a point whereby they don't tolerate your rules anymore. And there are, depending on different regulatory targets, there are different degrees of elasticity. So capital I mentioned as an example. So that's where US has actually been rather active. So Sarbanes-Oxley was an example whereby US is more stringent in regulating corporate boards and some other aspects of financial markets than the EU has. But then there's been a huge discussion as to whether it actually leads to New York losing some of the trading activity to Hong Kong, to London, and to other less regulated markets. This is a contested topic among corporate law scholars. John Coffey, a few others have come up with this kind of bonding hypothesis, meaning that sometimes companies actually want to list in a stock exchange that has very high regulation because that's a credibility, quality signal, if you like. So it doesn't mean that capital is perfectly elastic, and every time you would have high regulation, capital would seek a more benevolent regulatory environments. But you still have a lot of tax havens. You have a lot of, you have much more ease to move your capital, and you can't do it with consumers. There's very little elasticity. If you are a producer from China willing to serve the EU market, and you basically are faced with too high environmental or consumer protection standards, you would need to physically move those consumers into another market. So what you actually do is that you try to see whether there are other markets where there's demand for your products. And because of the sheer number and the affluence of the EU consumers, it's very hard for you to substitute that market by an opportunity elsewhere. It's slowly changing. I mean, Chinese consumers are they're already numerous, but they're going to get much more affluent. So there's going to be demand for the kind of products and for the kind of services that now are demanded in the EU. But that's basically the zest of that part of the theory. Yes?
Yeah, I mean, it does seem like the strictness element does have a ceiling. So, like,
Sure.
if it becomes too strict, if a standard becomes too strict, then it's no longer in a firm's best interest to even care about the European market or to not divide their standards. Yeah. So do you see the European Union acting to tone down the strictness of any regulations in order to sort of tailor them for export?
Right, so obviously there's an internal debate within the EU as well, how strict these regulations ought to be. So a lot of the companies in the EU are hurt if the regulations are too strict. And the EU decision makers, they're not immune to that. They also want to restore competitive industries. So if you are an EU company, first you may be opposed to these strict regulations. But once they already apply to you, it's in your interest to lobby that they also apply to your US competitors. So then you actually become a proponent of the Brussels effect. But in the first place, you have an incentive to lobby and to influence the political process. And the EU also is not sort of devoid of that kind of process where the companies have a say in what the regulatory outcomes are. So the EU is not sort of self-inflicting the kind of cost that destroys its economy. So I think the internal checks are, again, the ones that work there. But you're absolutely right. There's some kind of point where the curves meet, and at some cost, everything can become divisible, when it's just like prohibitively expensive. Yes?
Is there a process in which an EU member can opt out of an EU-wide regulation, or can for instance, the British simply refuse to enforce a financial transactions tax?
Yeah, so UK likes that a lot. They do opt-outs. So Denmark does opt-outs. There are certain regulations from which you can opt out, and that has been now the big discussion with the attempts to move towards greater fiscal union in the euro crisis. It's the UK, where a huge part of the British GDP comes from the City of London and from financial services. And the UK is afraid that its interests are being harmed. So UK is very actively willing to either stop that kind of regulation from coming into effect, which it can do in the areas where unanimity is still required. But then EU has increasingly moved towards not requiring unanimity. But you only need to have a certain percentage of the votes of the member states behind it, and basically laws apply to also those countries who oppose the law in the first place. Sort of going back to the earlier question about democratic deficit to some extent, that democratic deficit is not exactly the same question, but it doesn't mean all these rules are always serving the interest of each individual member state. But yes, I don't go into it, it's rather complicated, but there are possibilities under certain circumstances to opt out from the EU rules. Yes?
I guess one question I had.
Sorry, yeah. Do you want to go? You can go first and then Amanda. Yeah, please.
Okay.
You can
the question I had, so it seems like the Brussels effect might be limited to cases where the regulatory breach is evident from the product itself and doesn't require domestic regulation or domestic monitoring. So I guess what I'm thinking of is, in the case of China, for example, a lot of the regulatory deficits that we think of, whether it's environmental protections or labor protections, they would require domestic monitoring to uncover, and they wouldn't be evident to the product that makes its way through. So I'm wondering, is that just a limitation of the Brussels effect, or may the Brussels effect have the potential to ameliorate some of these more domestic issues?
No, I'm not exactly sure that I understand the question fully. So let's sort of work it together. So it's not just a matter of product standards, but it certainly requires that you can monitor the product. And it's much easier for you to do when the product is physically coming into your country. It's much harder, for instance, if the EU is trying to have a unilateral climate change regulation by basically requiring that it bans or puts a really high tax on products that have been produced in the way that have emitted greenhouse gases, because then by inspecting is this where you wanted to go? Where you don't have traces of that process that you are trying to prevent in the actual product itself. So then the question is that China is importing a bunch of materials, products into the EU. Is EU going to rely on China's word as to how it was produced, what kind of factories, how much they emitted? Or are we going to try to somehow have China agree for us to send inspectors? So that's absolutely much more difficult. It could be doable. There are ways, for instance, in climate change, we try to think about that EU could calculate somehow defensible average emissions that would be emitted if China was using best available technology. So giving China the kind of benefit of doubt, but still being able to slap some kind of tariff on them. But you're absolutely right that it's much harder when the actual physical product, subject to your monitoring and examination, is not crossing your border. The same thing, EU has been trying to limit the dumping of hazardous waste, but it's much harder because nobody has an incentive. Let's definitely dump that waste into the EU. They want to dump it into, say, developing countries. It's much harder for the EU to try to sort of monitor that kind of activity when the actual products are not coming into its territory. The same reason why I say, like, EU's strong preference for strict respect for human rights, it's much harder for it to enforce through this kind of mechanism. Yes, Amanda?
My question was going to be, to what extent does this impact new membership in the EU? So you can see an Eastern European country where their local market may be more important for them than EU, or they can undercut EU competitors in China and Russia, so they decide not to join the EU to avoid that paternalistic state, the regulatory state. Or it gives them more incentive to join the EU since they're going to be subject to the regulations regardless because of the Brussels effect. So which way do you see that kind of balance?
Right, so that's interesting because it could cut both ways. In general, the memberships in the EU have been perceived to be so vast and deep that they exceed whatever benefits you are foregoing, even if you need to then adopt higher domestic regulations and then sort of reduce your competitiveness in some third markets. So because of the proximity of trading in the single market, where often the transport costs are very low, it's very attractive for you to be able to export your goods into the country next door and benefit from the single market. But also then it can attract a lot of business to your country because it's not just that the US companies may not like the idea that the EU has really strict rules, but they also wouldn't like the idea that they would need to produce to 27 different standards when they are trading in the EU. So somehow you can jump into that kind of pool of countries that becomes a very attractive trading bloc, and that creates it sort of opens you export opportunities elsewhere within the Europe and elsewhere, but it also makes it easier for the others to do business in your country when it's a predictable regulatory framework that they're already very used to dealing with in the other member states. Yes?
You mentioned one way for the United States to influence this would be to participate in treaty negotiations with the EU. To what extent is that effective if the EU doesn't need the United States, if it has a critical mass to do it unilaterally?
Right. So that's a great question because anyway, even if the US was to do this, so was to negotiate a treaty, EU is the one that has the bargaining power, right? Because the EU can, and EU should probably more consciously use it. If you are advising the EU and wondering, like, why is EU often so weak in, say, climate change negotiations? It's to say, look, if we don't do this multilaterally, this is the other option. This is the alternative. We're going to do it alone. So that would sort of change the negotiation dynamic to some extent. But there is some genuine commitment that the EU has to multilateralism. So even though this paper now sort of writes against the conventional wisdom that EU is not just a good benevolent multilateralist, it's also a very active unilateralist. EU still often likes to get things done multilaterally. That's the way EU does things within the EU itself. And often these laws, what I think is actually interesting that I didn't mention, but EU doesn't even perceive this all to be unilateralism. When EU thinks about some of these regulations, all they think about was this massive effort to multilaterally within the EU to get this regulation through. They associate that regulation with much of compromises and multilateral bargaining. So in the sense, that's the way the EU does things. That's the way EU believe has worked for the EU in many instances, and that works for the world as such. And sometimes too, it doesn't help the EU necessarily that this is done unilaterally. There are areas where EU, for instance, is a net exporter, not net importer. Then EU has less power that it can derive from the sort of guarding the access to its market, but it actually can't have enough influence, so it does need the other countries to enter into a treaty or change their domestic laws. So since EU has many areas where it still needs cooperation, there's this idea of reciprocity, that EU may be better off if there's a kind of grand bargain that EU agrees, comes a little bit towards the US if we can strike a deal on climate change. And then it can also persuade the US to cooperate in some other area as well. So I would certainly say that it's something that it's an option that is very attractive to the EU. And again, going back to the airlines, the regulation itself says that EU will reevaluate if there will be an international treaty. Excellent. Any other questions did you still have?
I just have one
Sure.
last question. Is there any evidence that these heightened standards, which you said emanate out of Nordic countries, might have a negative impact for Southern European countries? I'm thinking of like maybe manufactured goods. Right. A German company might be able to manufacture a toaster up to these standards, but a Spanish company might actually be very expensive to meet those standards.
Right, and that's why there's been like a lot of internal bargaining, that there are countries who have low manufacturing costs, who have lower environmental standards, lower consumer protection standards, various laws. The UK has much lower labor laws, for instance, lower standards when it comes to that. The countries want to guard what is essentially their competitive advantage. So it's absolutely true that some of these laws have had a negative impact on some countries. Why they've gone aboard? Sometimes there hasn't been a requirement of unanimity. They haven't, the majority has basically decided. Sometimes it has basically, they haven't been in the kind of position to bargain. Often these roles, going back to Amanda's question about accession countries, when you join the EU, you don't pick and choose. You basically take the bundle of laws that are there. So you are not always in a position to say, I don't like this will harm me. So a lot of the new member states where this was a very big concern, they had a choice of joining the EU on EU's terms and forgoing those advantages, or then basically not joining the EU, and they have generally decided to join. Excellent. So thank you, everybody, and have a good afternoon.